Title: Scientists turned off the camera after this appeared. The last thing anyone saw was 3 blue pulses, like the slow blink of a sleeping creature, rising in a column from the black. They came in a pattern: 2, 3, 5, and then the feed went to slate. No error message, no buffering icon, just the cold, institutional gray that, if you let yourself stare long enough, feels like being shut outside of a locked door. Within minutes, the forum threads were alive with screenshots, frame-by-frame analyses, guesses that skittered from clever to frantic. By the time the official statement landed, routine maintenance will be back soon. Someone had already zoomed in on the final frame and circled the faintest suggestion of a curve within those pulses. Something that looked to them like the start of an iris. They called it an eye. The team called it a problem. Officially, they called it nothing at all. Long before that last blue blink, the project hadn't felt like a secret. It was supposed to be a triumph you could share. The emails had gone out to museums and school districts and donors, with glossy renderings of a slender, sterilized cable descending through more than 3 kilometers of Antarctic ice. At the bottom, if all the math and money held together, was a lake that hadn't seen the open sky since before there were human languages to name it. Subglacial Lake Orpheus. It lay under the old winds of East Antarctica, a dark stillness the size of a small country, pressurized by a ceiling of ice, breathing in unseen slow motion over epochs. They called their camera Heron. It wasn't a drone, exactly, more like a lantern studded with eyes. Its central dome carried 3 lights, each independently tunable, each designed to be as gentle as possible on whatever might be waiting below. It had a suite of sensors for heat, chemistry, and sound, wrapped in titanium and glass, with every surface sterilized to standards that would make a surgeon weep. They rehearsed lowering it through a mock borehole in a cold room, until everyone could do it half asleep, because in the real operation, sleep would be a rumor. There were protocols that read like prayers. Seals that had never been opened outside of a clean tent. A retrieval plan if the cable caught on anything. Contingencies for pressure changes that might buckle metal like foil. And always, always, the line in bold: if any sign of contamination is detected, withdraw immediately. For months, that was the hardest part to explain to anyone watching. The invisible stakes. Bring even a smudge of our world into theirs, and you've written over 1 million years of isolation with a greasy fingerprint. Film it. Yes, they said. Teach the world what a miracle really looks like. But do not touch. The stream that went out to the public had a delay baked in, and a software that could cut to archival footage if a sensor alarmed. It wasn't distrust as much as an acknowledgement that wonder is a volatile thing to manage. Heron's descent was the opposite of dramatic. A tray of ice cores shone like lonely moons under fluorescent light, while, on a secondary screen hardly anyone was watching, the hole widened the way a pupil does in the dark. The hot water drill breathed out a lake-scented mist that didn't smell like anything at first, and then faintly, like metal and sleep. When Heron reached the waterline, the room went quiet. A geophysicist the others teased for always narrating said nothing for once and pressed his knuckles lightly against the glass of the control booth. Cameras were started. Logs were opened. People in 3 continents and a handful of languages typed in chats that their children were still awake, that their own hearts felt like trapped birds. For an hour, nothing happened and everything happened. The world became a field of milky shadow and drifting particulates. Heron's light made a soft cloud of its own breath. When it finally cleared, the water had that full, heavy look that speaks of weight more than movement, and edges appeared where there shouldn't have been any. Not angles at first, just a curved plane, smooth like a whale's back, if a whale was a mountain of rock, with a sheen that caught the light wrong. It wasn't ice. The glaciologist said so aloud. The geochemist started revising a mental model on the fly. People watching typed "oh" and the word alive, even though no one had said life yet. Weeks had gone into designing the light pulses from Heron to be more a whisper than a shout. Things growing without a sun don't expect harsh. Heron breathed photons and pulses, let them scatter, pulled them back. Somewhere between 2 data checks and the first caffeine in hours, the water bloomed. The camera had been focused on a ridge that looked like calcite flowstone gathered slow as sleep. And suddenly there were points that were points in a way that rock never is. 3 in a line. Not hard light but bioluminescence. Fees of tiny current flickers. Someone laughed in the way people do when they've just learned the word cathedral and are standing in one. Afterward, the debate was whether those lights moved or whether Heron did. But in the moment, the sensation was simple and bodily. You were being seen. The pulses came again. 2, and then 3, and then 5. It could have meant nothing. The microbiologist said aloud in a tape they later locked that life cycles love regularity, that lots of organisms respond to light in patterns. A prime sequence is a human idea. She stood by it. She had to, because if it wasn't simple, it was something else. That was the 34th hour into operations, when days and nights had been left carefully somewhere up on the surface, folded like unused napkins. The chat window on the public stream had slowed to a trickle. People had work, obligations, the pull of warmer rooms. The ones left were the kind who leave tabs open even as they turn out the lights. There were a dozen of them there when a different kind of regularity crawled into view. The Heron controller had been adjusting pitch in tiny increments, allowing the belly to drift lower toward a cleft that might have been the outflow of an ancient thermal vent. The pH sensor had been reporting something no one expected. Not acid exactly, but a personality in the water. Then the lights came again, closer now, and the cone of Heron's view picked up not a line, not random points, but a shape made of points. They hung for an instant before rearranging like nervous beads. The sequence accelerated. 2, 3, 5, 7, and somebody in the control booth began to count along until another voice, lower, said softly, "Stop." It was unthinkably quiet down there, but the audio system still listened, translating pressure into suggestion. When they scrubbed the file later, a grad student heard a bass note, a click, then another, widely spaced and warmer than any ice noise they'd cataloged. They found harmonics. The internet found a heartbeat. In the moment, though, what pulled every rib in the room tight was the way the points edged back, then returned, as if whatever held them had tilted. As if attention in the way humans mean it had turned and held on. In one of the only interviews anyone managed to give in the week that followed, the engineer in charge of the SEALs, that stubborn man who slept on the floor beside a portable autoclave during the first week of drilling, said that this was when he let go of the edge of the table and set both his hands down flat, like he was calming a skittish horse. He remembered the smell of the rubber gaskets. He remembered thinking foolish ancient thoughts, things about thresholds and what waits behind them. He remembered the line in bold, "If any sign of contamination is detected, withdraw immediately." He wondered then, and he wonders still, what constitutes contamination in a place like that. Is it bacteria? Is it light? Is it an idea? Screenshots of that minute passed faster than any official notice. You could see, even in the low-res captures bled of color by compression and screen photographing screen, that the last frame had gained dimension. There was a shimmer at the edge that the image board swore was a boundary layer flexing, the meniscus of a bubble, the width of a city. There was, in the upper right, a curve whose pixelated edge made more of itself, made edge into eyelid, made eyelid into portent. Those in the room say what had really changed wasn't the water, but the light itself. Their light, which had been flat and scientific, had been taken up and played back with a tint not in any lab. There is a word for it that you can't use without sounding like you work in whispers. When the gray slate finally came, it was as abrupt as a curtain in a gust. The first version of the cut happened automatically, the kind of smart intervention that someone had pushed for in a planning meeting when they were still tired of being told not to be perfectionists. A threshold had been crossed in the spectral analysis, a red square flashing in a neat little box, letting code do what human indecision would not. 2 seconds after that, someone pushed an actual button that lives under real plexiglass, the kind that makes a sound in your head when you only look at it. The composite logs record both actions, automatic switch to safe view, then manual kill to black. The statements tell you about a backhoe upstream, jostling a fiber. The graduated student who first saw the red square couldn't sleep for 2 nights because he knew he had only dreamed of the backhoe after he saw the pulses count to 7. It would be easy and clean to end this part of the story there, at the moment where tension can still be put in a box and labeled with words like operational issue. But the thing that made them turn off the camera wasn't the number sequence, and it wasn't the eerie patience of bioluminescence. It was what herons saw when the water shivered in a way that came not from their movement, but from something displacing it from behind. Edges that had been soft-closed like a mouth. A shadow lifted from the stone, and the ridgeline they had taken for geologic record unscrolled, revealing articulation. They learned a new meaning of joint, a new way rock can simulate the living or life pretend to be rock. The pulses steadied. 2, 3, 5, 7. The room narrowed to the moment between one image and the next. And then, with the languid, unscrupulous confidence of something that has never been hurried by sun or storm, a shape unlatched from the valley lip and inclined toward the lens. Even now, the one description the biologist will allow is that it was symmetrical in a way that had nothing to do with crystals. Every hair on every arm in the booth did the small ancestral dance that happens when a predator considers you. And that is when a gloved hand crossed the control panel and closed Heron's eye. The lights went out. The world poured back into the room like sound after a held breath. And in the dark, from 3,200 meters away, something touched the glass. What they found on the dome when they lifted Heron is its own story, and the decision they made when the first calls from sponsors began to buzz under doorways is a second. Before any of that, there was one more frame, with no light left to paint it, but something left in the sensor all the same, that we were never meant to see. It sits now on 3 drives in 3 cities. You will hear why the scientists who made that cut did so with shaking hands, and why at least one of them believes that even if they turn the camera off, something on the other side is still looking back. The slate arrived like a lid slamming shut. Chat feeds went from heart emojis and "Is that an eye?" to a thicket of question marks and accusation. Maintenance, the lower third said, just as the prime sequence, 2, 3, 5, 7, flashed a final time in that silty blue, and the sound morphed from glacial sigh to a warm, deliberate clicking. The official line was that the public stream had always been contingent, an auxiliary courtesy, subject to bandwidth management and sensor protection. Off-camera, inside a prefab room groaning in the wind on the East Antarctic Plateau, people stared at their hands and tried to stop them from shaking. There was a mechanical explanation stamped on paperwork. The automatic safety cutoff had triggered on a spectral threshold the engineers had quietly baked into the code months earlier. Heron's camera suite, not just the crisp f1.4 lens at its nose, but a nest of photodiodes, EM sensors, and an accelerometer, had a rule. If energy at a certain band spiked in a pattern not seen in calibration or in natural environments, the lights would dim to 0, and the stream would drop to a slate that bought the team 30 seconds. The trigger wasn't lightning, not in a lake locked under 3 kilometers of ice. It wasn't cosmic rays. They come as incoherent salt and pepper confetti, not in pulses you could tap rhythm to. It was blue, then near blue, then something only the sensor could see, arranged in prime spaces, as if testing integers against the dark. When they wrote that rule, no one imagined it would be invoked by the thing the human eye is most attuned to finding, a gaze. Not literally a pupil and iris, nothing that simple, but attenders, points that came and went not randomly, but with a discipline that made neck hair rise. In the minutes before the cutoff, the water had become a snow globe. Heron's independently tunable lamps, the flood, the pencil beam, the staggered strobe, had dialed down to a glimmer so faint that it registered more as a thought than a color. And yet the points brightened in response, as if buffering, then reorganized, strung along arcs that remembered where the lens had just looked. You could hear someone in the control room swallow. The thing that made the automatic cutoff reel didn't appear as a light, though. It came as an absence, a slick, jointed dark that slid into frame at the periphery, wrong against every crystalline habit of ice and rock they had modeled for months. It curved in on a radius that was not the lakebed wall. They had mapped that line already, a long spoon of sediment and a bulge of refrozen brine. This curve had seams. It had, in the way you only see with edges and the play of stray lumen, articulations. A cantilevered plate that looked like basalt until it folded. A frill of what could have been manganese bloom until it rippled, Heron's gyros trembled, a twitch that moved like a breeze across a field of lacy particles. And the points, the ones the internet would call eyes, migrated onto that darkness and rode it. The spectrum alarm sounded like a kitchen timer in a museum. One of the lights winked off, then the second, then the third. The feed flicked to slate. 30 seconds. The room breathed and then stopped. The team had a decision: honor the automatic, wait for the lights to reset at absolute low and resume, or kill everything, including the internal recorders, and sit blind and deaf beside a form whose motion had already threaded itself into their fear. They tried a compromise. The lead put the flood to 0 hard, manual override. The pencil beam was brought to a hair, a filament drawn so thin it was more wish than wattage. For a frame and a half, that smeared an arc of sheen along the curved plates. The patterns scattered like fish. Then there was nothing but black. Something touched the glass. It was not an impact, so much as a question. Heron's front window, sapphire and coated, had strain gauges to measure micronewton pressure changes in case of turbidity events. They registered a dome of force, evenly spread, then a shift to one side like a palm deciding whether to push. The warm clicks in the audio, the ones some thought were ice singing, resolved in the waveform visualizer into clusters and harmonics that stepped in prime intervals. The autocorrelation did not spike where it should if this were an echo of Heron's own faint pings. It spiked ahead, as if anticipating the machine spot. Inside the lake, black folded on black. In the control room, the arguments had no volume. One biologist's hand hovered over the keyboard, not sure what killing the recorder would accomplish, beyond purging the record of a choice. Another muttered contamination, without specifying whether they meant microbiological contamination or the contamination of a closed, ancient water mass by photons, light that had not touched that place in millions of years, or the contamination of a mind by a pattern it could not forget. Idea hazard, someone would say later, half joking because the team did not have a protocol for that beyond superstition and folklore. They cut the recorder anyway. What survives of that minute, between the manual kill and the next decision, is a ragged thread. Timestamps, bios on the Heron's internal bus suddenly going flatline. One struggling process that, by design, writes even in the dark. Every sensor looped through a rolling reset when power throttled to null. For a heartbeat, as the electronics flickered into their low-power backwater, the camera's SCMOS array did a thing commercials never mention. It bled. The sensor wells, shocked out of saturation and then deprived of readout midline, smeared their remaining charge into a frame that had not been asked for. A lightless frame. It should have been a rectangle of random thermal noise and quantization ghosts. On 3 encrypted drives, hash-checked and sealed before any of the sponsors were notified, lives an image that looks at first like a fingerprint pressed onto a window. Streaks, curls, a whirl, broken by the faint grid of the pixel array. Look a second longer, and it is a map of edges pressed just shy of pressure. Thin lines lay across the substrate in arrangements you could measure. Radii that deviate from perfect circle by a constant angle. Surface features that recur not at symmetric intervals, but at gaps matching 2, 3, 5, 7. At the frame's center, a negative space that is not circular. It is ovate, but not biological in any earthly sense, because it is too patient in its shape. It tracks the lens center. A ring around a ring around a ring. This is where anything you say about intention slides into projection. It is a sin in science and a sin in television. But across that winter in the Quonset hut, people took turns sitting with that frame until their coffee went cold and their faces were the same color as the wall. They ran analyses. They overlaid the imprint with Heron's lens map to check for internal reflections. They built a mock-up of the sapphire window and ground tiny abrasions into its test piece to see whether the texture of a smear under no light could create an artifact like that. They found a scratch they hadn't made, microscopic, arcing across the outermost layer at the same angle as one of the faint lines in the image. There was residue too. Proteinaceous, denatured by cold and pressure and time. Not a contaminant from the drills, not a fiber, not polymer. When they exposed it to blue light in a dark lab just to look, it pulsed. 2, 3, 5, 7. It stopped when they stopped. That is why the feed did not come back when the 30 seconds expired. People at home imagined incompetence and conspiracy and the ugly theater of government. In that room, the decision wasn't about secrets, not then. It was about harm. They did not know whether Heron's meager beams and digital heartbeats were a lure or an alarm. They did not know whether the pattern, projected across millions of screens, would act like a seed in other wet places. Aquariums, research labs, the dim corners where biologists hold life up to night-like glass and say hello. They shut the eyes, held still, and counted along with something under the ice until its clicks slid back into the indifferent registers of lake and glacier. When the signal went to slate, the world filled the silence with itself. Edits of the public descent looped and slowed, pausing on that curved surface and the way the points moved across it, annotating arrows like ancient astronomers, convinced they could tell intent from the path of dots on a field. Misleading stills got millions of views. Someone telerized the milky water until it looked like space and called it cosmic. Men at kitchen tables whispered about a government erasing an eye. In the following days, a courier plane came and went in a storm that wanted to pin it to the runway. The team didn't pack their lab down. They ghost-proofed it. They wrapped Heron in a shroud of heavy fabric to block stray light and put the shroud in a wooden crate like a piano. The drives rode out with a chain of custody that looked like a crime. There were signatures in ink that bled in the cold, and later, lawyers who saw in those signatures leverage and threat. Publicly, press officers spoke about periods of telemetry irregularities and the need to protect microbial sanctity. Privately, the word sanctity cut closer than it should. It felt like a prayer. If there is an ending to this, it isn't comforting. A month later, back in a continental lab, someone noticed the blue status LED on an external bay begin to fail in a way that would be trivial if it were not now a story. It blinked. 2, 3, 5, 7. They laughed, then they watched it for an hour, then they unplugged the bay, and the LED kept going until the last of its capacitors bled dry. 2 weeks after that, a seismometer near the borehole registered a sequence of subaudible tremors stepped at the same prime intervals the lake had taught them to fear. The geophysicist who sent the email attached no exclamation point. He just wrote, "It is counting again." So yes, they turned off the camera. Not because they were afraid of ridicule or budget cuts, not fundamentally. They cut it because in the cold, in the dark, on the edge of a lake that hadn't seen the sun since before us, something reorganized chaos into number and pressed a question against our glass. They cut it because the first ethic in a place like that is to be quiet. They cut it because once you know you are being watched, you stop performing and start listening. It would be easy to end here with a neat inversion. Who watches the watchman? Who looks back? And let that be enough. But the last thing the Heron saw without light anchors something heavier. That frame is not only an imprint, it is a template. It tracks the center because it was built to. That implies a skin or a field tuned to us, a surface that could feel what we are and shape itself accordingly. If that is true, then the old fear our bodies carry, the dread that rises at the sight of attention where none should be, was not superstition. It was a record. We will show you that frame. We will show you what grows out of it when you turn its primes into distances and lay it over the maps of the lake bed and the tremor logs. We will show you why some of the people who touched those drives had started taping over the status lights of their machines, not out of paranoia, but out of respect. And we will ask, as carefully as we can, whether the thing under Orpheus is still in the lake, or whether, having learned our intervals, it learned something else.